Uh, Fighting Back Against Hate, Language, and the Power of Racist Words. It's sponsored by the Committee of 100, and that will be on March 3rd from 8 to 9 p.m. And so, yeah, everyone's attention is on Russia and the Ukraine and NATO right now. So we really appreciate you recognizing we are the Committee for a Sane U.S. China Policy, but of course we want a sane U.S. foreign policy everywhere, not only towards China, even though our focus is on China. But of course, all of these issues are interrelated when we think about U.S. foreign policy and what its goals are and what its impacts are. So I actually see the issues as kind of closely intertwined with each other. So I'm very excited to introduce the speakers for tonight. We will hear first from Professor Moon Ho Jung, who is a professor of history at the University of Washington and the author of his first book, Coolies and Cane, Race, Sugar, and Labor in the Age of Emancipation, and his new book that just came out this month, Menace to Empire, Anti-Colonial Solidarities and the Trans-Pacific Origins of the U.S. Security State. We will then hear from Tobita Chow, who is the director of Justice is Global, a project of People's Action Institute, and a member of the Committee for a Sane U.S. China Policy Steering Committee, as am I forgot to mention that. And our final speaker will be Jenny Lee, who is professor at the Center for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Arizona, and the editor of the book U.S. Power in International Higher Education. Each speaker will have approximately 12 to 15 minutes, and then we will have plenty of time for questions and answers afterwards. So if you have questions, you can post them in the chat if you have questions as we're going along. And we will get to those after about 45 minutes. So Moon, do you want to begin?
Sure. I'm going to take my glasses off because I need bifocals, but I am resisting them as long as I can. All right. All right, so thank you, Avi and Joseph, for organizing tonight's panel discussion. I'd like to begin with two sentences from my recently published book that I really like. Yes, I am quoting myself, okay? So these are the words of that brilliant historian, Moon Ho Jung, okay? To point out the obvious, a democracy rooted in empire and white supremacy is not democracy. That's American democracy. Now, tonight, I don't have practical prescriptions on how we can counter anti-Asian racism, but I would like to suggest that recognition of what the United States is and has always been should be an essential starting point. That is, if we recognize the United States not as a multicultural nation that welcomes and embraces diversity, but instead as an empire rooted in white supremacy from its founding to today, then I think we can begin to see how anti-Asian racism is not an aberration or an exception in US history. Rather, anti-Asian racism has been an essential element in the making of the United States as an empire and as a nation. So to work against that history, to challenge that history, we have to first recognize that past and as such, and second, recognizing that past, recognizing that history suggests that this liberal hope that so many people hold on to, this liberal hope of being recognized as full-fledged Americans is beyond an impossibility for Asian Americans. Rather, it's a misguided hope that ultimately feeds the racial and colonial order that we like to call the United States of America. So to get at those points, let me elaborate on my initial quote to hopefully clarify some of the issues that I think we confront today. So I'm going to riff on that initial quote, okay? To point out the obvious again, empire and democracy cannot coexist, okay? So if the United States is anything, it was and is an empire that has claimed unilateral authority over lands and peoples, and in recent decades has claimed the authority to incarcerate and kill basically anyone living on our planet, all in the name of freedom and democracy, of course. As long as the US empire exists, American democracy will remain an oxymoron. Now, it was in that historical project of white supremacy and empire that laws against sedition proliferated in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. I know that we've been hearing that term a lot, sedition, over the last year, but the most recent iteration of that term, sedition, is, if anything, the aberration. Okay, that is, it's rarely been applied historically to right-wing fascists, right? And I suspect that usage will end pretty soon. Historically, those who have been condemned and criminalized as seditious in US history were those struggling against white supremacy and empire. Now, I could go way back in time, but let me begin with the Philippine-American War at the turn of the 20th century. In 1898, when Spain and the United States went to war, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Theodore Roosevelt, decided to launch an attack on Manila in the Spanish colony of the Philippines. Spanish forces, reeling from 2 years of fighting against Filipino revolutionaries, surrendered to American forces. So in December 1898, the United States agreed to purchase the Philippines for $20 million. Filipinos who at one time thought that the United States could be an ally against the Spanish refused to submit to a new colonial master. So in 1899, the bloody Philippine-American War began, in which hundreds of thousands of Filipinos were killed by the US military. Now, no matter how many Filipinos the US forces killed, or because of that high death toll, those struggling for Philippine independence would be refused to surrender. And so to control the unruly masses, the US Philippine Commission passed in 1901 the Sedition Act, which prohibited, quote, any person to advocate or orally or by writing or printing or by like methods the independence of the Philippine Islands or their separation from the United States, either by peaceful or forcible means. Okay, you could not speak out on behalf of Philippine independence. That was marked as sedition. Now, that law is crucial to understanding the logic and rhetoric of race and empire. Defining sedition, or defining who is disloyal or un-American or anti-American, has everything to do with empire. It was all about securing empire. Sedition is a legal and political category that has been about protecting, securing the US empire. And defining sedition also had everything to do with race. Filipinos contesting the US empire were racialized as the N-word, or later gugus, which then evolved into gooks, and other terms, making them fit only for mass annihilation or colonial tutelage. And that was why Filipinos were deemed seditious. Those ideas of sedition, loyalty, and disloyalty would proliferate over the course of the 20th century to mark anyone engaged in struggles against racism and colonialism as seditious. Anyone who dared to confront and challenge white supremacy and the US empire has been marked historically as disloyal, un-American, communist, gooks, and so forth. Sedition, in turn, would be inscribed in US immigration law to categorize anti-colonial activities as crimes against the nation. and race naturalized that connection between sedition and immigration to secure the US empire. Although the US Constitution enumerated no explicit authority on immigration controls, laws and legal cases on Chinese exclusion in the 19th century had conferred the federal government with unilateral and exclusive power in all matters related to immigration and deportation. It was the beginning of a legal and political discourse that fundamentally linked immigration law to national security, a link that persists to this day. So in a critical phrase in the Chinese exclusion case from 1889, the US Supreme Court ruled, quote, "To preserve its independence and give security against foreign aggression and encroachment is the highest duty of every nation, whether from the foreign nation acting in its national character or from vast hordes of its people crowding in upon us. The government possessing the powers which are to be exercised for the protection and security of its people is clothed with authority to determine the occasion on which the powers shall be called forth." So if the US government categorized foreigners of a different race as dangerous to its peace and security, the Supreme Court ruled, its designation and exclusion could not be stayed because at the time there are no actual hostilities with the nation of which the foreigners are subjects. And that was national security in a nutshell. If the US government deemed you a threat, you were a threat to US national security. And race marked the Chinese and other Asians as a threat to US national security. Now, let me move forward in time a bit. In the first half of the 20th century, the US state, through intelligence networks, military campaigns, and immigration agents, marked Asians as seditious threats, in part because of their anti-colonial and revolutionary aspirations. And those aspirations came to be linked not only with anarchism and communism, but to Imperial Japan, deflecting and projecting nefarious activities against the US empire onto Imperial Japan, in the process made the US empire supposedly defensible. So in November 1907, the Military Intelligence Division, or the MID, authored one of the earliest global surveys on US national security, and it really dwelled on Asia. Asians and Japan in particular. And it completely disregarded the Filipino grievances against US colonial rule, and the United States claimed sovereignty over the Philippines until 1946. That report from 1907 fixated on Japan's racial and imperial ambitions. The report stated, quote, "Japan has for many years desired to unite the people of Asia with herself as the dominant and controlling power. She believes that she has a heaven-sent mission to control the affairs of the extreme Orient, and all her efforts have been directed to this end for a long time back." Many anti-colonial revolutionaries in Asia and around the world indeed look to Japan for inspiration, and they often romanticize Japan as a role model against the West. A revolutionary newspaper in the Philippines argued in 1908, quote, "Filipinos, we do not want Japan as a ruler. Nevertheless, we want her as a leader, as a redeemer, as a guide, as breath to the existence of the nations of the Orient, and of a people gathered under the same name and united by ties of fraternity and of blood more or less strong." Rather than listening to Filipinos' desires for freedom, for independence, US officials looked for signs of Imperial Japan at work. So one US official in the Philippines responded, "I have no proof, but I am convinced that the Japanese government owns or at least controls that newspaper. It did not. Let me move forward in time a little bit more. So about 80 years ago, during a turbulent time when anti-Asian violence and war threats mounted, individuals felt compelled to choose sides. Carl Juneda, a Japanese American who had gravitated to communism because of that movement's efforts to organize workers of color, including Asian Americans, and because the communist movement took a decisive stand against colonialism, he felt that he had to make a choice, either Japan or the United States. And despite being arrested by the FBI shortly after Pearl Harbor, Juneda vowed to support the United States in the war effort, quote, to help Spanish Japan's fascist imperialists for democracy. And even though the FBI would continue to monitor Juneda's activities in a concentration camp, he became an informant for the FBI. On the other side of the Pacific, Artemio Ricarte had worked for decades to make the Philippines independent. He refused to pledge allegiance to the United States, and eventually he would be exiled in Japan. And in 1942, shortly after Japan claimed the Philippines during World War II, he would return to the Philippines on a Japanese military plane and raise the Japanese flag and deliver a speech advising Filipinos, I'll be done in 1 minute, advising Filipinos to cooperate with the Japanese liberators, right? So in the throes of war, Juneda and Ricarte believed that they had to decide either Japan or the United States. But the fundamental contradiction was never between the United States and Japan. It was between empire and democracy. So as we attempt to confront and understand anti-Asian racism today, I suggest that we take that historical lesson to heart. It will be tempting to claim our Americanness, but at the same time, whatever we might say, we will be marked as un-American. So we can't be misled by those labels. We can exploit those labels, use them ironically if we have to, but we can't be led to believe that American democracy is real democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, we will hear from Tobita.
Thanks, Avi, and thanks everyone for being here, and thanks to my fellow panelists. I'm looking forward to checking out Professor Zhang's book this year. It's on my list. So I want to talk a bit about what I see as the core narratives that stem out of this growing U.S.-China rivalry that I think are feeding anti-Asian racism. This is an ongoing part of my work at Justice is Global and something that we've been working on since going back to 2020. We're not too far from the 1-year anniversary of the mass shootings in the massage businesses, the Asian massage businesses in the Atlanta area, which was a major turning point in terms of like popular and media attention on the problem of the rise of anti-Asian racism. There's one very common account that was given of it at the time, which I think still shows up, which is really putting the blame on former President Trump, and especially his use of explicitly racist terms like Chinese virus in Kung Flu back in 2020. That clearly did make a huge difference when Trump and other Republican leaders started using that language. There was a study of social media posts tracking anti-Asian racist rhetoric on social media, and it found an immediate spike in anti-Asian racist language in tweets about the pandemic, like the very day that President Trump started to use that language. So it clearly made a significant impact, and many of the incidents of anti-Asian racism that we have seen since 2020 have involved comments that very clearly connect Asian people to the pandemic, calling us coronavirus, accusing us of being bad eaters, saying you're diseased, you caused COVID. Like this is a definite trend in the rhetoric, and it can be clearly traced to Trump's rhetoric. But at the same time, it's very clear that Trump is not the whole problem. Trump is now long out of the White House. He's even been kicked off of Twitter, but it seems that like anti-Asian racism may even be getting worse in his absence in the public sphere and on social media. So there's clearly a problem here that goes beyond Trump, and we need to understand Trump and his nationalism and his racist rhetoric is just one example in a broader trend in US politics and society that has to do with growing tensions between the US and China and the ongoing imperial aspirations of the United States that, as Professor Jung noted, has like a long history. So there is, I think, an idea that I think is a fantasy among many people on sort of the liberal part of the political spectrum who are committed to great power rivalry with China, to like strategic competition or whatever it is that they call it, but believe that they can engage in this great power rivalry with China without racism and without the risk of it spiraling as well into international violence. And I think this is a fantasy. There's a quote from Professor Russell Jung, who co-founded Stop AAPI Hate, that I think really encapsulates the dynamic. He says, when America China bashes, then Chinese get bashed, and so do those who look Chinese. American foreign policy in Asia is American domestic policy for Asians, which means that the foreign policy that America directs at Asia blows back on people who are Asian within the United States. It's American domestic policy for Asians. So what we're seeing is a rise in anti-Asian racism is part of growing China bashing in US politics. And that is something that goes beyond Trump. It's like more extreme and vicious on the right, but it extends across the political spectrum. This is unavoidably something that is going to drive racism. Now, I think there are a lot of valid criticisms of the Chinese government that we should not shy away from. But there is a specific kind of China bashing that I think is particularly responsible for the growth in anti-Asian racism. And that's a growing trend where leaders in US politics and in media on the right and among liberals and across the political spectrum will exaggerate and inflate the kind of threat that China poses to the majority of Americans. So it's these China threat narratives, these narratives about how China is a threat to America, the American way of life, it's a threat to you and your family. Some clear examples of this. So for example, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in 2020, before he left office, had delivered a landmark speech on China that portrayed the threat of China in basically apocalyptic terms. He said, if we bend the knee now, our children's children may be at the mercy of the Chinese Communist Party. So, China is coming for your children and your children's children. He said, securing our freedoms from the Chinese Communist Party is the mission of our time. So American freedoms are under threat, and it is China that is putting American freedoms under threat. And this is Secretary of State Mike Pompeo under the Trump administration saying that despite the fact that very clearly the greatest threat to freedoms for the vast majority of Americans is coming from the Republican Party and specifically the authoritarian movement that Trump and Pompeo and so on represent. This manifests itself most clearly on the political right, but to an extent this extends across the political spectrum. These kinds of statements are extreme exaggerations. The Chinese Communist Party has no aspirations to take over the United States or really interfere that much in the internal politics of the US. And yet it is now common to hear US politicians and other leading figures say that China is an existential threat to the United States or a threat to the American way of life, to blame China for all manner of problems in US society. And all of these are extreme exaggerations. And I want to say a few things about where these exaggerations are coming from, like what is driving them. Like why are leaders in politics and media in the US so frequently engaging in threat inflation when it comes to China? One important dynamic is the commitment to American exceptionalism and to US military and economic domination over the entire rest of the world. As the United States is declining in relative power in the world, and China is rising out of its previous position as a subordinate country in the US-led system, those who are invested in American exceptionalism have a sense that US domination is at risk. And that can feel like an attack. Like that can feel not just like an attack to US power, but as a threat to the United States itself. And I would compare this to the way that some white people experience threats to white privilege as an attack on white people, or the way that some men will experience attacks on male privilege as an attack on them, right? The attack on your power, if you have a certain attachment to power and privilege, then an attack on that power, a threat to that power or privilege can feel like an attack on you. And in many discussions about China, we see an easy slide from the very plausible claim that China is a threat to US hegemony to the implausible claim that China is a threat to the United States or to every American or to the American way of life. This unquestioned commitment to American exceptionalism can make these two claims seem equivalent. And so we see this very easy slide. So that's one source of these inflated China threat narratives. In addition, many leaders seek to turn China into a scapegoat for problems within United States society that require solutions within US society, but they sort of scapegoat China for those problems so that they can avoid dealing with these problems that are internal to the United States. This is a particularly potent strategy for conservative politicians who oppose measures that would challenge corporate power and improve living conditions or address injustices within the United States. So for example, Trump's use of the term China virus was a way for him to escape accountability for his catastrophic mismanagement of the pandemic. When Republicans like Pompeo portray China as the greatest threat to American freedom, despite their own support for authoritarianism and their threat to the freedoms of people in the United States, that's like another way of scapegoating China for threats to US democracy and freedom. It's particularly useful if you yourself are the threat to US democracy and freedom to imagine China as the primary threat to that. In the same way, and this is going to be very important in the midterms, I fear, we have Republicans who oppose any measures to improve wages or the rights of the working class, who are now turning around and arguing that China is the greatest threat to US workers, and therefore the fact that Republicans are tough on China makes Republicans the party of the working class. This has been laid out very clearly in Republican strategy documents that they want to claim the mantle of party of the working class. And the way they're going to do this is by scapegoating China for all the problems that American workers are facing and sort of claiming themselves as the party of the working class because they are tough on China and Democrats are weak on China. We're going to see this in the midterm elections. So there's that. This is the scapegoating strategy. It is particularly useful for those on the right, though sometimes you will also see figures in the Democratic Party engaging in it. Finally, among members of the Democratic Party and among liberals, we see many joining in on China bashing and China threat narratives because they hope to rebuild bipartisanship with Republicans based on anti-China politics. There is this hope of anti-China bipartisanship. This was, Democrats have attempted to use this in the Build Back Better fight, which failed. They're attempting to use it now in these bills, the Compizza-Usica Act, which is a combination of industrial policy supporting high-tech manufacturing, but also a lot of like hawkish anti-China measures. There is increasingly the idea that anti-China bipartisanship is going to be the one way for Democrats to work together with Republicans to reach across the aisle and get things done. And this is, as Congress falls into increasing dysfunction, this is a real threat that they're going to double down on this strategy more and more. I'm going to wrap up there. I'll wrap up with some notes on like how we deal with this. We need an alternative strategy and alternative policies that are geared towards a new vision of the world that allows for China's rise and doesn't make apologies for some of the bad policies within China, but does allow for China's rise and envisions a world beyond American hegemony and American exceptionalism. We need narratives that can allow for a positive vision of America's role in the world that is not reliant on American exceptionalism. And we need alternative narratives about the U.S.-China relationship that are based on cooperation rather than competition and conflict. That's the work that we're engaged in Justice is Global. And this is something that needs to be incorporated into all of our politics.
Thank you so much, Toby. That was a perfect complement to the first talk. And now we will move to Jenny Lee.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. I'm in Arizona. The sun is setting behind me. So if the colors change, it's not the mood lighting, it's actually the sunset. So I'm a social scientist. I'm not a historian. I work with data and I use data to tell the story and hopefully change policy. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to share some of my joint research and observations, particularly as it relates to global science, in ways that scientists come together addressing the world's problems, whether it be COVID, global warming, and anything and everything in between, but how this is being shaped by anti-Asian racism. So I'm excited to share this recent work because if you haven't read or heard already, the U.S. Department of Justice announced the end of the China Initiative last week. I'm very proud of the fact that this research that I'll be sharing with you today was widely publicized and cited in major news outlets throughout the US and even abroad, and helped to inform the end of this very damaging initiative. This study that I'm about to share with you demonstrates the power of data in research and making a positive difference. And of course, though the China Initiative is over, our work is far from over, of course, as we'll further discuss, hopefully towards the end. So to provide some broader context we've all observed a dramatic rise in anti-Asian hate crimes in major cities. It's exponential, hundreds of times over the past year. San Francisco over 500%, Washington, D.C. over 2,000% higher in 2021 compared to 2020. This is also happening in smaller towns and even in universities. In Tucson, Arizona, where I'm zooming from now, a close Asian colleague of mine was run over by a car, and the same car was identified by the police as having done the same to another Asian earlier that day. This didn't make major news, but some statistics suggest that as many as 1 in 5 Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have experienced a hate incident in the past year. So as the previous panelists have referred to, is this anti-Asian hate has also coincided with the rise of China's global power, including in science. So in 2017, there was a pivotal year because this is when China became the world's largest producer of scientific articles, surpassing the United States, and still is higher. And meanwhile, geopolitical tensions between the countries have been mounting. Our then President Trump called for a report on his presumption that China had a negative impact on the United States, or was at the time. And then, of course, the subsequent report indicated that China's wealth was a form of quote unquote economic aggression, and that this rise was a threat to the US and globally. There was also special attention paid to universities as being vulnerable targets, that this is a place that might house spies who would then collect information to be used against the United States. And so the China Initiative was born in 2018 and continued through the Biden administration. And this was to protect against external threats that would undermine US competitiveness with a focus exclusively on China. And since then, and even now, since the China Initiative ended, universities are still under considerable pressure from the FBI as well as federal granting agencies to monitor potential espionage. And among these have been to strictly monitor and enforce conflicts of interest when it comes to scientific inquiry and collaborations. Many of you may already be familiar with the many high-profile cases that reached the US mainstream media. Most recently, Dr. Gang Chen's case was dropped due to a lack of evidence. And there were numerous other Chinese scientists whose cases were dropped or found exonerated. But you may have heard as well that their professional careers and reputations were greatly damaged in this process. These stories don't account for many more who suddenly left and returned to China because they could not afford legal expenses or were under pressure because they didn't have permanent legal status. Those on temporary visas may be prone to simply leave the country, then face criminal charges, not because they're guilty necessarily, but because of their insecure positions in their residency and not knowing their rights or lacking the same rights. University responses have also varied. You may have heard that Dr. Chen was well supported by his institution in MIT that paid for his legal bills. And on the other extreme, Dr. An Minghu, who was fired by the University of Tennessee, but after the court case and a lot of public protests was eventually permitted to return. Most of the names associated with the China Initiative were not coincidentally Chinese, nor is the China Initiative probing new. Andrew Kim and the Committee of 100 looked at court cases related to economic espionage. And over the past 15 years, they found that Asians were twice as likely to be falsely accused, punished twice as severely as non-Asians, and only 3% actually involved academia. When looking at China Initiative cases directly, an MIT review report found that 9 out of 10 defendants were Chinese, and yet the cases had to do with administrative procedures and false reporting, no evidence of systematic spying from China. These patterns have been observed before, such as post-World War II, we had our Japanese American internment camps. There was a lack of evidence that Japanese Americans were involved in espionage for Japan, and yet Japanese Americans were forcibly imprisoned because of the physical characteristics that they shared. Even Trump's numerous initiatives to limit Chinese nationals is also not new. Remember the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. This was the first immigration law restricting an entire population based exclusively on ethnicity and country of origin. In this case, the Chinese were back then stereotyped as a danger to the American people. Yet, despite current evidence and lessons from history, much of the political rhetoric you may have read or heard positions China as stealing, as taking away what is supposedly ours, meaning Americans. But when you look at the data and the research, you will see a very different story. In a bibliometric study I published last year with John Hout, we found that China's scientific trajectory is rising much faster compared to the US. With or without the US, China will continue to rise. Yet when we look at US scientific productivity, the trajectory is much flatter over time, and the slight upward trend that we're seeing is actually supported by US collaboration with China. In other words, the US needs China more than China needs the US when it comes to scientific production. I don't know how many politicians would admit to that fact, but it is indisputable when you look at the data. So given this context and the major consequences for the United States, I'm going to discuss some of the recent findings that in a study I conducted with Xiaoji Li and supported by the Committee of 100. If you're not familiar with them, they're a nonprofit advocacy organization of Chinese American leaders in the US, I believe also having some session that was just promoted in the beginning of this webinar. So Xiaoji and I surveyed scientists working in the top 50 universities in various national rankings. So these are the most research producing institutions in the country. And we surveyed both Chinese and non-Chinese. We had a sample, about 2,000 respondents, about half of them were Chinese, half were not. They included faculty, postdocs, and graduate students. They included US citizens and foreign nationals. So there's 3 takeaways that I'll give in the remaining time that I have. First of all, Chinese and non-Chinese report a high level of interaction with Chinese scientists based on a shared value of China's expertise. Despite national polls that have a pretty negative view of China, when it comes to scientists, they understand the value that Chinese scientists bring to their work. About a half of Chinese, a third of non-Chinese have conducted research with China in the past 3 years. And an overwhelming percentage believe that Chinese scientists make important contributions to the field. Even when it comes to their own research, about 80% perceive that Chinese scientists were important. Number 2, there was a clear pattern of racial profiling, and this part of our study received the most media attention. So despite the shared value of collaboration among Chinese and non-Chinese, the Chinese scientists were more likely to suffer from racial profiling compared to those who are not. A third experienced more difficulty in obtaining research funds, professional challenges, which they attribute directly to their race, nationality, or country of origin. And 1 in 2 reported that they were afraid that they were being surveilled by our US government. The proportions were far lower for those who were not Chinese. Third, racial profiling is not just a civil liberties concern, although that alone is enough reason to be concerned. But this racial profiling has negative consequences for the US enterprise, which drew national attention, regardless of whether one feels about China racist or not, that the US competitiveness is being undermined. So among the scientists who engage in international research with China, almost half of them have limited their communication with China. A fourth decided not to work with China on future projects. And among those who ended their research with China, it was self-distancing. It was a greater reason than any COVID disruption. And they also avoided any sensitive topic that would cause them to be scrutinized by the FBI or even their own institutions. They also avoided federal funding because if you're familiar, federal funding agencies have been criticized as being overly scrutinous about China. So anti-Asian China policies also changed the landscape of intellectual migration. The US, of course, has long attracted Chinese students and scholars. However, 4 out of 10 non-citizens indicated that the FBI investigations or the China initiative affected their plans to stay in the US. Several commented that they would prefer to, or they're considering options in Europe, going back to China. I mean, potential talent loss is certainly concerning. So to summarize, both Chinese and non-Chinese highly value US-China collaborations. They agree that limiting such collaborations is not good for science. However, there's a real distinction between the Chinese and others, where the Chinese scientists report greater profiling, fear, and anxiety of being surveilled. And they have limited their engagement with China. They are self-distancing, avoiding working with Chinese students and scholars, staying away from sensitive projects and federal funding. So in closing, as I mentioned in the beginning, we're proud of being among the key studies to inform the end of the China initiative. In last week's address, Assistant Attorney General for National Security, Matt Olson, introduced a more comprehensive plan that would not focus on China. He made clear that the China initiative gave rise to the perception that the DOJ is singling out anyone of Chinese heritage. This was true in our study and made clear to the public that even Chinese Americans, US citizens as well, were feeling targeted. So in closing, questions remain as to whether or how racial profiling will continue. We know that anti-Asian hate is not within law enforcement or the courtroom alone. It's in classrooms, labs, and a range of settings. And we know that Asian Americans experience microaggressions more frequently than any other community of color or minority group. That means for every Gang Chen or An Minghu case, there are many more whose stories remain hidden or silent, but may not be sensationalized, but nevertheless damaging. So what we do need, I know my time is up, is that we need more ongoing clarification on federal as well as university policies, consistent reporting, more transparency, and really more focus on ways that there may be potential work that harms national interests, but what about our own institutions that harm us? Such damages are hardly addressed and rather repeat themselves. We need more racial climate research. We need to ask the hard questions. Last words are science and discovery are inherently borderless. They're key in addressing the world problems, but they are being reshaped when geopolitics enter in. They potentially threaten our pursuit of knowledge and they threaten our academic freedom. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you, not just for your incredibly interesting presentations, but for being so punctual and stopping right on your 15 minutes. And I really also appreciated the thread running through the three presentations about the relationships between the US domestic racism and US foreign policy and the geopolitics, and how we really can't understand one without the other, or we can't understand anti-Asian racism without seeing it in its global context and the US policies towards Asia and China. So I see we have a number of questions already in the chat. If anybody would like to ask something, please post it, not in the chat, in the Q&A. And I have a question that I'm actually going to jump in and start with, and then I will move on to the questions that have been posted here. Because I feel like the Trump administration provoked a kind of a liberal backlash that included anti-racism as part of that liberal backlash to Trump. And that in kind of polite liberal circles, the denunciation of racism has become kind of automatic and some sort of at least superficial anti-racism. And yet, I feel like there's a huge failure to make the connections that were being made here tonight, that we can't just denounce racist language or racist acts at home as if those were happening in isolation from these larger issues that Moon mentioned at the beginning, and that both you, Tobita and Jenny, built on in terms of geopolitics. So I guess my question, and for any or all of you, is what's the nature of this kind of what feels like a kind of a knee-jerk and superficial anti-racism that abstracts it from its larger context?
Does anybody want to go, or? Well, I can take a first crack at it. I think it's something that really goes back to social scientists, you know, people like Robert Park and other folks studying race in the early part of the 20th century, who conceived of race in terms of personal attitudes, right? And I think the legacy of Park and others is to pose colorblindness and racism as polar opposites, right? And it's always framed in individual terms. So you are either racist or not. You are either a racist or colorblind. And that's obviously a false dichotomy, because I think colorblindness now is the vehicle through which white supremacy is being perpetuated, right? And so I think, as you put it, in liberal circles, it's about disavowing racism, right? But I think we need to be getting at the deeper roots, as we've been talking about, right? And that's the more difficult project, right? Because we can make it into a national project, and I think a lot of Asian Americans have joined in that chorus, right? to claim and proclaim our Americanness, right, in this multicultural nation, but that really doesn't address, at least I don't think, the kinds of institutional anti-Asian racism that's been there from the very founding of the United States.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think like there is there's just overall a spirit of individualism that like shapes and warps how we understand our social problems, and that is very much true when it comes to issues of racism. We think of racism as a thing that exists only within like the head of the individual, when that's not true. It's embedded in institutions. It's reproduced by the entire social structure, and like the racist attitudes and beliefs and prejudices of the individual are part of like a greater whole, which extends across all of society and across institutions. Yeah, it's just there is such a powerful habit of thinking of racism as the thing that is just in the mind and in the words of a person, and there is and that enables this idea, which I think you'll often get from sort of liberal proponents of great power rivalry between the U.S. and China, who would like to think that if we just sort of like really watch our words and what we say, then we can keep doing the escalation against China without having the racism, and it's just an illusion.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to look at some of the questions that have been posted here. So we have a question from Jack Farrell. Ronald Takaki has noted that Chinese Americans have been struggling against discrimination since at least the Civil Rights Act of 1870. How does civil rights relate to the issue of anti-Asian racism?
Well, I think I can take a crack at it if you want. You know, I think the person may be talking about, you know, the 1870 amendment to the Naturalization Act of 1790 that restricted naturalized citizenship to free white persons. Yeah, Chinese, Japanese, other Asians who came after them, they wanted citizenship because they knew it meant access to power and privilege in the United States. So I think it's definitely part of the discussion, but what I would propose is that we be critical of that notion of citizenship, right, as being universal. And what I would argue is that, yeah, we should be demanding citizenship for people denied, undocumented immigrants. Definitely, they should have an access to getting their papers and eventually to citizenship. But at the same time, I think we need to be very critical of the idea of citizenship because it has never been universal, right? It in fact has been the means through which the racial divides that we have been talking about have been created from the outset, right? So yeah, let's demand progressive reforms, right? If you want to call it civil rights, but at the same time, let's be critical of these ideas like citizenship, because ultimately, I don't think that will afford us the kind of liberation and justice that we really want.
Are you kind of suggesting that the concept of citizenship and claiming rights through citizenship is connected to the idea of American exceptionalism?
Yeah, and white supremacy. Yep, absolutely.
Okay, did anyone else want to say anything on that question, Jenny?
We also know that, you know, in recent legislation, I mean, China Initiative, but also anti-immigration legislation, that U.S. citizens have been deeply affected. I mean, even the Patriot Act, in ways that individuals were targeted, even though US born or naturalized. So I think this concept of citizen gives us a false sense of protection, security, maybe exceptionalism, but when we see how policies are playing out and who may unintentionally be harmed, I think that really does change what it means to be a US citizen and different variations of citizenship at the same time.
Okay, we have a question from Patricia Rodriguez, who asks, why is bashing allowed in Congress? It would seem that this is more a street social thing, but not professional at all.
I think, I don't know what to say. Well, I mean, it's just like, there's a set of countries that just get designated by some sort of political consensus among elites in the US as sort of like, my term for them is like officially bad countries. And then once a country like falls into that category, then what you might think is the normal standards of civility and so on kind of go out the window within Congress and also, you know, and more broadly in elite circles. You know, I think we can also see that in other cases as well. Yeah.
You know, I've looked at a lot of the congressional record in the 19th century and go back and read those, and you know, you'll see that that it is a tradition that goes way back.
So we have a question from Shideko Terai. How is messaging affected by activist language using social justice activities instead of advancing justice? I'm thinking of Martin Luther King Jr. Center Waterfall with the words, "Let justice roll like a mighty stream." I feel too often white people avoid stronger plain language, and it seems to sanitize the cause and overlap with racial justice.
So I may have a different take on this, but I do feel that justice itself needs to be problematized. What does that exactly mean? It sometimes associates reckoning with the past, and I personally do not think that's possible. I think that we need new language moving forward in ways that we can create change. And I think what that looks like might actually really differ across groups. And I think those are the conversations we need to have. But justice assumes some kind of reckoning that I think, I mean, my panelists may disagree, but I do not think is possible.
I don't have a take on that question, but I do think, I think like something that the question might be getting at is, I agree there's like a super sanitized version of racial justice language that has come about because, I mean, one thing that's happened is there is a version of anti-racism that has been adopted into like the corporate world and that kind of stuff. And there's definitely a tendency for racial justice issues to get sanitized and sort of like, in a sense, like hollowed out so that they can become like more acceptable, like within that part of society, and less challenging and less critical of our society as a whole. Yeah, I think like it's important not to let that version of anti-racism or that version of racial justice determine how the rest of us do our work and talk about these things. And we need to use the language that is actually going to work for our intended audience. So if our intended audience isn't like corporate managers, but is like the millions of people in the multiracial working class, I think that has to be the agents of change in the society and the world, then we need to figure out language that is going to resonate with and appeal to that potential base. So it's got to sound like less corporate, it's got to sound less academic, it's got to be more visceral and like meet people where they're at. And I think that's part of like just good racial justice organizing.
So you're not a fan of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
I think it can have its place. It can be useful for certain purposes. But if your goal is to organize a mass movement to defeat like fascistic, racist authoritarian movements, for example, I think that's not going to get you there.
So I guess I didn't quite understand the original question. I guess I'm trying to get my mind around Jenny's comment that justice is not plausible. Like justice as a vocabulary is not conducive to reckoning with the past. Is that what I heard? I guess I'm just trying to figure out where we're at.
If we think of colonialism, if we think of slavery, I mean, justice cannot be achieved, right? So what exactly do we mean in defining what would justice look like? Because justice is often based on something that has already happened. So I'm proposing, is there another way for us to frame it moving forward, while recognizing, of course, our own history?
So I guess, are you proposing something else? I guess I'm just trying to figure out how you're conceiving of reckoning with the past, I guess.
But Jenny, are you suggesting that there's really no way to repair the past and that we should be thinking about how to create a more just future? Or yeah, I was a little confused by that.
Well, for example, I've just recently attended this talk that was, very much based on, there was this debate on Afro-pessimism and Afro-futurism, right? And ways that we can think more towards not what will always be, but what could become. So, I'm not an expert, I'm just answering the question, but I'm certainly open to other interpretations of the two frameworks. But I think that really did catch my attention, because I just wonder, moving forward, are there other frames, concepts beyond the justa that is just, I think, overused and maybe not well defined? But I'm open to, other interpretations of that question in my response.
Well, for me, and what I say now may not be relevant to what you just said, but I think how we frame these particular issues, how we approach the past, how we interpret the past has to be part of the conversation, right? So we can talk about slavery. Let's take slavery as an example, as an original sin. You can talk about, the way Obama did, slavery's answer, like the answer to slavery was inscribed in the Constitution, right? Which is kind of ridiculous if you think about it critically, because the U.S. Constitution could not have been more pro-slavery, right? And so if we frame the issue of slavery, let's talk about slavery as a founding institution alongside colonialism as the founding institution of, that gave birth to the United States. That kind of a framing, I think, changes the conversation, and I think could lead to what we might call collective justice or justice, right? And so I guess I tend to see it, I don't know if that's being more hopeful or not, but I think how we frame the past, how we reckon with the past is a deeply fractured and contested process that we have to be involved in, right?
And I guess I would also just say that in all of the conversations about the Ukraine, I've been quite shocked at how many historians I know have tried to start history on February 22nd, 2022, as if nothing had ever happened before February 22nd, 2022. So then we just have to analyze what happened starting on that date. Whereas if you can look back 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years, you can understand how we got to February 22nd, 2022. So a question from Dennis Gong. Is the anti-intellectual tradition in US culture finally having an effect on US competitiveness in STEM?
That's a great question. We know that science denial, something that I never even heard until I think at some point around the Trump administration, right, is a real questioning about whether or not, fake news or whether or not empirical data, what is actually informing our policy, but even just the denial of science and the scientific method clearly is having an effect on the weight of science and its impact on policies, and also where resources are, as well as the suppression of scientific findings. I'm thinking of global warming as an example, right? So I think that's a good hypothesis. I don't know directly, but I think it's certainly plausible that we have seen these things happening at the same time with the rise of science denial, but also China's rise in science. I mean, China's rise in science is not because the US is falling back. It's just a tremendous amount of R&D investment. But clearly it's an interesting observation.
So I have two questions that I'm going to put together here that focus directly on anti-Asian violence. So Linda Freeman asks, anti-Asian violence comes in many different forms. How do we instill decolonizing the mentality across the entire spectrum? And Dennis Gong asks, much anti-Asian violence is being done by people who are very much not white supremacists. How could this be addressed without becoming part of the culture wars?
On that last question, I suspect this is about the fact that a lot of the highest profile incidents of anti-Asian violence have that where we have video and so on, the perpetrators are people of color and not white. Which is so one thing to say about that is like I'm not sure I can speak to this with any authority. Maybe Professor Lee may know better, but I've read things about by researchers that have really looked into the statistics of the people who are perpetrating acts of anti-Asian racism, and have like sort of critiqued the perception that we get through media that like Black people in particular are disproportionately represented among these acts of anti-Asian racism, and that there's like questions of media bias that come into that, and also there's also I think, as I recall, there's like there's a disparity in we're getting reports of anti-Asian racism in all different areas, and some are urban, some are suburban. And one disparity is that a lot of the video footage that we have is from urban areas where there are just like more video cameras like everywhere. And then what you end up is like incidents that sort of like the racial segregation of urban versus suburban spaces then gets reflected in like the video that we end up with is like one thing. But it's like I think like clearly the increase in anti-Asian racism is not, it's not just a feature of like white people and white supremacists, but I think we I don't know, it's like we need to understand again like what are the root causes of these trends, and they have to do with these broad social trends that encompass all of US society and US politics. And they have to do ultimately with the increasing anxiety felt in US society because of the rise of China. I think that's like a super important root cause that we need to understand. And there I think we can see a connection to an attachment of white supremacy that is, I think to understand the attachment in US society to like US hegemony in the world and American exceptionalism, you have to analyze that in terms of white supremacy. And what you get out of that is a set of ideas that is not limited to white people. Like everyone of any race can internalize those ideas. So this is, this is a little this gets like a little nuanced. Like we want to say like, white supremacy, that's a thing that white people do only. But actually what we see are narratives, white supremacist narratives that are grounded in white supremacy that they don't get, like anyone can internalize them. And I think this is a feature of racism in general that can sort of feel complicated, but this is not just this, all forms of racism are like subject to this dynamic, and it's not just anti-Asian racism.
I'll just chime in to say, these acts of anti-Asian violence are committed by individuals, and I'm not trying to discount that, right? I think we need to definitely confront them and address these particular acts of racial violence. But at the same time, I suggest, or I would propose that we need to be thinking more broadly, more critically. Where does that anti-Asian animus come from? And why is it so ingrained in American culture that it can get expressed in such horrific terms, right? And become normalized. And, I think it comes back to what Martin Luther King Jr. said on April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before he was assassinated. When he started talking about the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, my own government, or the US government. And so if you think about anti-Asian violence, okay, let's just take that term, right? Well, I would suggest that we need to be thinking about the Philippine-American War, right? World War II. The mass incarceration of Japanese Americans, the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, as acts of anti-Asian violence. And I don't think most Americans are ready to really deal with that past. But I don't think you can remove anti-Asian sentiments, anti-Asian violence today from that history, right?
So we have a question from Siddhartha Banerjee. The United States has not really disavowed the practice of interning people of the wrong ethnicity, the quote, wrong ethnicity, during emergencies, real or fabricated. Do you think something like the Japanese internment can happen again?
I think it would be a mistake to think that US society has somehow become better or more virtuous and outgrown those sorts of practices in that sense. If there's anything stopping from that sort of thing from like recurring, it comes down in my mind to a question of power. So when I think of the risks as the US-China rivalry escalates, as I think about the risk of similar practices being imposed on like masses of people of Chinese descent in the United States, the thing that gives me hope is not the idea that somehow we've like outgrown this as a culture or society or whatever, but it's that I think we have the potential to build and exercise more political power than people of Japanese descent during World War II or Chinese immigrants during the Chinese exclusion movement. And I think there could be a real struggle over the extent of racist policies that we see as this conflict heats up, and it's going to be a question of power.
So I actually wonder, and maybe somebody else wanted to say something to that question, but because the way you answered it really leads us to another question, maybe I'll just jump right to that other one. And then if anyone else wants to jump in, they can talk about both of them, which is about hope. How hopeful is it that white supremacists have now been indicted for sedition and that the Trump so-called China Initiative investigation has now been terminated? I don't know if you want to just expand on your answer or sort of connect what you were just saying to a more specific answer to that question.
In terms of the sedition charges, I don't think that, what do I think here? I think like the struggle against the far right in the US is going to be longer and protracted. And so, and is going to, have to take place more at a popular level, rather than in like legal cases. Although like that can be part of there can be cases where that's helpful too. So yeah, I don't know. This is just not where I personally look for hope. I look more to like, can we organize a multiracial pro-democratic movement in this country to defeat this stuff? Yeah.
I mean, I think I'll answer the previous question maybe more than this one. You know, not only can it happen, but I think it's happening. I think, you know, people are being racialized and being incarcerated. I mean, you saw it in terms of, you know, what was happening on the US-Mexico border. Guantanamo definitely during, you know, the so-called war on terror. So it's not so much that it can happen, but I think there is a reason why every time there is a policy along such lines, like every time that they pop up in the United States, you know, Japanese Americans are on the front lines, right? They are organized. You know, when the Muslim ban went into effect, I mean, Japanese Americans were there, right, decrying what was happening. And, you know, when Japanese Americans started talking about what had happened to them during World War II, you know, it was in the late, and when they started to do it collectively and in public, you know, it was in the late 60s when J. Edgar Hoover was talking about interning the Black Panthers, other Black revolutionaries under the powers of the McCarran Internal Security Act of 1950. And so they led the movement to overturn that particular provision of that law. So I think, you know, I would agree. I think it's about organizing. I think it's about organizing against such policies, but I don't think we can be deluded into thinking that it's not possible, because it is very much possible and being carried out right in front of our eyes, right?
So in response to the second question, as it relates to the China initiative, I think there's a lot of cautious optimism. The FBI has made it clear that now, rather than exclusive focus on on China, that we will be including Iran, North Korea, Russia, a list of particular questions, countries. But questions remain about the extent to which, well, what is the evidence that is creating these particular foci? And in the same way that China was seen as a competitor, and the rhetoric that was used that targeted China in informing this policy, is this just a group of potential countries that we're targeting, and how will this affect scientists from those particular places as well as those that we collaborate with? So it's just a broadening of the targets, but I think the hope is, I think it's more of a relief, I think is a better word for the time being.
Okay, Mark Stern asks, do you find, as I do, that Americans do not want to be confronted with facts that contradict the anti-Chinese propaganda?
There's certainly resistance to that. So we've done some work at Justice is Global to have conversations with like as many conversations as possible with, we've done like phone banking into swing states like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, just to talk through just like random people on a list to see how they're internalizing these narratives and what it takes to move them off of it. So there is certainly there's always resistance to widespread resistance to anything that contradicts dominant narratives. And right now we do have a lot of dominant narratives around China that are mistaken, exaggerated, overblown, whatever. I think so my starting point though is not to do facts checking and come up with facts that contradict the dominant narrative. I think that's not the most effective way to change people's minds. So just in terms of how to approach these conversations, the way that we try to do it is that these narratives are important to people when they're important to people, they're important because they emotionally resonate with the person or resonate with their sense of identity or something at a deep level. And so that's what you need to figure out. What we do is we try to listen to people, and when they say the talking point about China that we disagree with, we don't get into an argument, but we try to figure out what is it about, how is that resonating with that person, and it's resonating with their sense of identity, their sense of American identity. In some cases, they have economic, they're worried about their job prospects, or they have some anxieties there, and China has become the thing that sort of distills and embodies those fears for them. And you need to figure that out, and then get a sense of where are there other sentiments that this person has. So for example, something that we try to tap into is the belief that a lot of people have in the need for people to come together to overcome divisions, to solve common problems. So that's a thing that you can tap into to promote a narrative that is more about the US and China cooperating on things that we all care about and that hurt us all. I think yes, there is resistance to anything that contradicts dominant narratives that people are buying into. There are ways to move past that though. And I think the most effective way is not to get into arguments with people, but to listen, to figure out what do these narratives mean to this particular person, and where can we find common ground and sort of build something new from there.
Just some recent, just based on recent history, I think there's some important lessons from the reversal of the China Initiative. So there was my study, other studies that clearly demonstrate this was undermining US competitiveness. No way do I naively believe that changed the course of the initiative. It was a group of, there were numerous efforts. So one was the scientific community that was demonstrating the research to show that this is not a productive initiative. We had advocacy groups coming together, signing petitions, professors coming together, Chinese as well as non-Chinese. The media, where there was just considerable coverage on the research as well as the petitions, the court cases that clearly demonstrated, as those who looked at the court cases that demonstrated there was no pattern of systematic espionage from China. So, and also with the university leaders, it was interesting to see, depending on if they were private or public, depending on where they were located, but also understanding very well that a decline of Chinese scientists and students would actually hurt their own ability to generate either grant revenue, publications, attract the world's top and brightest. And so these combined efforts, and not always the same drivers, but necessarily the shared concern about ways that these particular groups or institutions were being affected, I think did create mounting pressure to eventually reverse this initiative. So it comes from all groups and players.
Okay, so we have 4 minutes left and we have 2 questions left, and I actually have a question too. So I'm just going to read the last 2 questions and pose my question, and then give each of you a minute to make your closing statement, which can address one of the questions or go in any direction you wish. A question from Joseph Essertier. We're often told by the mass media that communist China is a huge threat. They're obviously taking advantage of 2 fears: fear of the other in a race sense, and fear of an alternative economic system. How do we challenge the economic component of the fear-mongering? And then we have a question from Go Sasaki. It feels like much of Asian American political discourse centers around achieving full rights and citizenship as citizens of the US. given that so many Asians in America are immigrants and children of immigrants who are admitted into the US only if they drink the American dream Kool-Aid, do you have some thoughts about approaches to develop a racially conscious, progressive, anti-imperialist, new Asian American movement? And finally, my question has to do with the threat to the American way of life, because I would say there actually is a huge threat to the American way of life, which is that it's completely unsustainable. And the threat to the American way of life is climate change. And that means we have to change the American way of life. We cannot continue the American way of life because we're destroying the planet for everybody. So I feel like we have to change that whole discourse and abandon the idea of an American way of life. Okay, Moon, do you want to go first?
I can, maybe.
This is your closing statement, whatever you want to
maybe it's in direct reference to Go Sasaki's, really incisive and insightful question, because I think that is the root of the problem. But let me preface this comment by saying, I don't know who's going to be watching this later, but I am a loyal American. Okay, the United States is the greatest nation on earth. In all seriousness, I think that is one of the major questions that we have to confront, right? How can we think about our position? How can we think about ourselves in ways that can drive us towards something different, something radically different, right? So when we write about Asian American history, for example, like how about if we stop presenting Asian Americans as, immigrants, coming to the nation of immigrants to try to live out the American dream. So let's reject that narrative, because I think that is very much a part of the racial and imperial project of the United States, right? By proclaiming it as the nation of immigrants. It's so toxic, right? But how about if we think of ourselves, Asian Americans, as racialized subjects of the US empire, right? Because for me, that is our racial position. And if we look at the past, look at the world from that perspective, new possibilities open up, and I think new kinds of solidarities can be formed.
Okay, thank you. Tobita, do you want to have your final word?
Yeah, I think I want to jump off of that as well. In a lot of my political work, I think sort of the go-to label for me and a lot of my peers has been like diaspora, and to think of us as and part of that thinking is that recognizing that our destinies as members of Asian diasporas here in the United States is tied to the destiny of people in our country of origin, and the way that our government in the United States treats people there is going to be tied to the way that they treat us here. And those of us who are here are not all citizens. Like we organize with immigrants who do not yet have citizenship, who maybe have green card, who are international students, right? So the category of citizenship doesn't really capture the sense of like who we are that we want to build, and that I think is necessary for us to like confront the challenges that are ahead of us. And I think like that's like one way to start to break down and overcome these like nationalist binaries and boundaries that are used to divide us. I think, I don't think, on the other hand, I'm not ready to give up on the category of citizenship, in the sense that I think there are important struggles that we need to have on the terrain of citizenship. And so I think we need to sort of think of both of these approaches at the same time. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Jenny?
Gosh, there's so much to say, but I'll just keep it quick. In thinking about US citizenship, well, okay, first of all, US exceptionalism, US competitiveness, maintaining our place in the world. I mean, all of those things, at what point the question is how much of that needs to be at the expense of human rights? And so in any ways, does that change what it means to be American when we need to think about maintaining our position in the world by having certain policies and practices that treat immigrants as subhumans? And I think that's where would be the guiding question for me in terms of how do we think about immigrants, the question about immigrants and how they're treated, how they're classified, the rights they have, and maintaining our own US positioning. And so I think that there's a lot of policies that this can apply to, particularly when it comes to immigration, as well as the ways that we treat and receive refugees and asylum seekers. So yeah, that's my short answer.
Okay, well, thank you so much to all three of the panelists. Thank you to the audience for your great questions. And if you're not already on our mailing list, please go to the Committee for a Sane U.S. China Policy website and sign up and follow us there. And the link to this event will be posted there in a few days or a week. And good night, everybody. Thank you all.
Thanks, Al.